My mother-in-law called me low-class trash in front of our son, so I found her hidden bank account, exposed her lies to the city, and buried her under her own fraud. The party was perfect. String lights crisscrossed the backyard on Larkspur Lane. Caterers set out brisket and coleslaw on folding tables. 60 guests filled our lawn to celebrate Tyler heading off to Whitmore College in 9 days. Barbara smiled the whole afternoon. She drank her Chardonnay slowly, the way she always did when she wanted people to notice her composure. She posed for photos with her arm around Tyler, laughing at things that weren't funny. She told my neighbor Walter, loudly enough for me to hear from the drink table, that she'd always known Tyler would turn out well despite everything. Despite everything. I let it go. It was a party. My son was leaving in 9 days, and I wasn't going to let Barbara's usual weather ruin the one good afternoon we had left with him under our roof. Sunday morning came, quiet and bright. I sat at the kitchen island helping Tyler log his gifts into a spreadsheet, the kind of task he'd normally roll his eyes at but tolerated because I asked. Card by card, check by check. Then I opened the envelope from Barbara. Inside was a check for $5,000. Generous on its face. Under the check, folded twice, was a letter in Barbara's perfect cursive. I read it once. Then I read it again to make sure I hadn't imagined it. Use this to become someone real, Tyler. It said, look at your father. He wasted his potential marrying an office temp. Tyler was standing 3 feet away, scrolling his phone, half listening. He hadn't seen it yet. I folded the letter along its original creases and set it face down on the counter like it might catch fire. I've worked 16 years as an executive assistant at Callaway & Voss Marketing. I paid off $58,000 of my husband Ethan's engineering school loans, working 60-hour weeks while Barbara sipped Earl Grey in the carriage house behind our home, the one we spent $85,000 renovating for her after her husband died. I slid the card and the letter across the counter to Ethan when he walked in. He read it standing up, and his face went the color of drywall. She has 30 days to leave, I said. My voice was flat. I didn't raise it once. Ethan begged me to reconsider before I'd even finished the sentence. I didn't blink. This wasn't one letter. It was 16 years of Barbara calling my job a typing gig, wearing black to our vow renewal, treating me like hired help in my own house. This was the first time she'd put it in writing, in her own hand, and handed it to my son. I picked up my phone and called my sister Diane. She's a real estate attorney with a spine like rebar. I need a notice to vacate, I told her. Today, if you can. 3 days later, before the paperwork even cleared, a landscaping crew showed up in Barbara's driveway and ripped out my hydrangeas, the ones I'd planted the week Tyler was born. 18 years of root system torn out in an afternoon to pour Barbara an illegal concrete patio she hadn't asked permission for. She'd paid the crew $6,200 in cash and pointed at my flower bed like it was hers to erase. That was the moment I stopped hesitating. Tyler was 18. He was 3 weeks from moving into a dorm 200 miles north, and instead of helping him pack, I was standing in my own backyard watching a stranger with a jackhammer destroy something I'd built with my hands. I thought about the letter sitting in a drawer in my kitchen. I thought about 16 years of small insults dressed up as concern, of Barbara telling dinner guests I kept house instead of saying I had a career, of the particular smile she wore when she introduced me to her friends as Ethan's wife and nothing more. I didn't grow up with money. My father drove a delivery truck for 26 years. My mother cleaned offices at night and raised 3 kids on a schedule that would break most people. I put myself through community college taking night classes while working the front desk at a dental practice. And by 24, I had a job as an executive assistant at Callaway & Voss, a mid-sized marketing firm downtown. I was good at it. I was promoted twice in 8 years. By the time Tyler was born, I was managing 3 executives' calendars, budgets, and travel, making $61,000 a year, which in Fairhaven in those days put a roof over our heads while Ethan finished his degree. Ethan and I met at a mutual friend's barbecue when I was 23. He was finishing his engineering degree at a state school, sweet and awkward, with a laugh that made me forget to be careful. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony his mother called modest, which I later understood was Barbara's word for not what she would have chosen. I didn't know then that it was the first of 1,000 small corrections she'd try to make to my life. The wedding itself should have told me everything. We held it in my parents' backyard in June, folding chairs borrowed from my father's union hall, a caterer who was actually my Aunt Rosalind, and a slow cooker full of whole pork. Barbara arrived 40 minutes late in a cream suit, surveyed the yard like she was appraising a property she'd been asked to condemn, and told my mother, within earshot of at least 6 guests, that she hadn't realized weddings could be done so simply now. My mother, who had spent 3 weeks sewing the tablecloths herself, smiled and said nothing, because that's what my mother did with people like Barbara. She absorbed it and moved on. I didn't yet know how to do that. I spent part of my own wedding reception in the bathroom, crying into a paper towel, while Diane stood guard outside the door telling anyone who asked that I'd gotten something in my eye. Ethan found me eventually, and I told him what his mother had said. He apologized, the way he always apologized for her, a kind of pre-written script he must have developed over a lifetime of smoothing her edges for other people. She doesn't mean it like that, he said. She just says things. I wanted to believe him. I was 25, in love, and it was easier to file the comment away as an isolated incident than to recognize it as the opening line of a pattern that would run for the next 19 years. My own parents never had much. My father, Ray, drove a delivery route for a regional beverage distributor for 26 years, out the door by 5 every morning, home smelling like diesel and cardboard most most evenings. My mother, Connie, cleaned 2 office buildings downtown at night, 6 to 11, then came home and made our lunches for the next day before she went to bed. We didn't take vacations. We didn't have a savings account with more than a few $100s in it most years. But my parents were honest about exactly what they had and exactly what they didn't. And there was a kind of dignity in that honesty that I only fully understood much later, standing in my own driveway holding proof that Barbara had spent 6 years lying about the opposite. Barbara Whitcomb had been a school teacher for 11 years before marrying Harold, a claims manager for a mid-sized insurance company, and settling into a comfortable, quiet existence in a colonial on Ashford Court. She never worked again after the wedding. She told people she'd chosen family over career, which she said with a specific, pointed look at me whenever the subject came up. Harold died of a heart attack 6 years ago, in March, on a Tuesday. While raking leaves he didn't need to rake because it wasn't even leaf season. He was 71. Barbara was 70 at his funeral, dressed head to toe in a black Chanel suit she'd apparently kept in storage for exactly this purpose. After Harold died, Barbara couldn't stay in the house on Ashford Court alone, or so she told us, though we later learned the house sold for $410,000, and the money seemed to simply evaporate from every conversation we ever had about her finances. Ethan, being an only child and a good son, offered to build her a space on our property. I agreed because I loved my husband, and because I believed at the time that family takes care of family. We spent $85,000 converting the detached garage behind our house into a 1-bedroom carriage house. New plumbing, a kitchenette, hardwood floors, a walk-in shower with grab bars Barbara insisted she needed, even though her doctor never mentioned any mobility issues. We financed $22,000 of it on a home equity line because our savings didn't stretch that far. Barbara moved in on a Saturday in June with 4 moving trucks worth of furniture that didn't fit and had to go into storage, which we also paid for, at $210 a month for the first year. She told everyone at Thanksgiving that year, the first holiday in the carriage house, that she was living on a fixed pension of $1,200 a month from Harold's insurance company and a small Social Security check. It became her explanation for everything. Why she couldn't contribute to groceries. Why she needed us to cover her property tax portion. Why she couldn't help with Tyler's summer camp fees the year Ethan was between contracts. I remember that Thanksgiving specifically because of something small that happened and that I filed away without understanding it. Barbara's phone rang during dessert. She stepped into the hallway to take it. I heard her say clearly, "I need to call my advisor about the accounts before the end of the year." When she came back to the table, I asked, mostly out of politeness, who her advisor was. She waved her hand and said she meant Harold's old life insurance paperwork, that there was always something to sign, some form to update. I didn't think about it again for 6 years. Living 20 feet from Barbara meant living inside a slow, constant erosion. She'd comment on my cooking in front of guests. She'd tell Tyler when he was young that his mother worked a typing job, even after I explained more than once exactly what I did and how much I made. At our 10th anniversary vow renewal, a small ceremony in our backyard, Barbara wore black, not navy, not charcoal, black, the kind of black you wear to a funeral. And when I asked her gently if she'd like to change into something more celebratory, she told me black was flattering on her and that I shouldn't take everything so personally. There was a specific dinner, 3 summers before Tyler's graduation, that I kept returning to in my mind once I understood what she'd been hiding. Ethan's college roommate, Marcus, was in town with his wife, and I'd spent 2 days cooking a proper meal, braised short ribs, a good bottle of wine I'd been saving. Barbara came over uninvited, the way she often did, and settled at the head of the table like it was hers by default. When Marcus's wife asked what I did for work, Barbara answered before I could open my mouth. "Lauren keeps things running for some executives downtown," she said with a small, indulgent smile, the kind you'd give a child describing a lemonade stand. "It suits her," I corrected her, said I manage budgets and logistics for 3 senior partners at a marketing firm, that I'd been promoted twice, that I oversaw a departmental spend of nearly $2 million a year. Barbara patted my hand across the table. "Of course, dear," she said. "It's important work, in its way." Marcus's wife looked uncomfortable for the rest of the meal. Ethan didn't say anything at all. I did the dishes alone that night while everyone else had coffee in the living room, and I remember standing at the sink thinking that I could not recall a single occasion in over a decade when Barbara had described me to another person without some quiet diminishment folded into the sentence. Ethan noticed some of it. He didn't see all of it, because Barbara was careful to save her sharpest comments for moments when he wasn't in the room, or to phrase them as jokes that would sound paranoid to repeat. "She's from a different generation," he'd say, when I brought something up. "She doesn't mean it the way it sounds." I believed him mostly, because believing him was easier than accepting that my husband's mother genuinely thought less of me, and that my husband either couldn't or wouldn't see it clearly. I kept working. I kept paying down Ethan's loans, $500 a month for years, until they were gone. There was a bad stretch, the year Tyler turned 11, when Ethan was laid off from a structural firm for 4 months, and we took out a second mortgage, $31,000, just to cover the gap and keep current on the carriage house's share of the property taxes, the same taxes Barbara told us she couldn't help with because of her fixed income. I remember signing those papers at the credit union, my hand cramping around the pen, thinking about how strange it was that I was going into debt to subsidize a woman's tax bill, while she sat 20 feet away with, as it turned out, more money than our entire mortgage combined. I kept renovating a house that was never going to be enough for Barbara and raising a son who was, despite everything, kind and grounded and mine. I told myself the carriage house was temporary, in the sense that everything is temporary, and that eventually the sharp edges would soften. 16 years taught me they wouldn't. The letter in Tyler's graduation card was the moment I finally believed it. Ethan drove to the carriage house that Sunday afternoon to talk to his mother. I don't know exactly what was said. He came back 40 minutes later, pale, and told me Barbara had denied writing anything hurtful, that she'd called the whole thing a misunderstanding, that Tyler would grow up and understand what she meant. I taped the 20-day notice to her door myself the next morning at 7:15 before I left for work, so there would be no ambiguity about who had decided this and when. Barbara didn't leave. Instead, she called a lawyer named Roland Whitfield, a man who ran late-night ads for slip-and-fall cases, and by the end of that week, he'd sent us a letter claiming Barbara had equitable interest in the carriage house because she'd contributed labor and oversight during the renovation. She had picked out grout color. That was the extent of her labor. Diane read the letter over the phone and laughed, once sharp and humorless. "This won't hold up anywhere," she said. "But it'll cost you time. That's the whole point of sending it." She was right. Whitfield's letter meant we couldn't simply change the locks. Diane explained that even a weak equitable claim, if filed as a lawsuit, would freeze the eviction until a judge sorted it out, and judges in our county took 4 to 6 months to clear a docket like that. Barbara knew this, or Whitfield knew it, and Barbara was smart enough to let him drive. I did what I always did when the ground shifted. I got organized. I requested every receipt from the carriage house renovation from our contractor, 6 years of paperwork proving Barbara had never contributed $1 toward it. I printed our home equity line statements showing the $22,000 we still owed. I built a folder, then a second folder, then a binder with tabs, because if Barbara wanted to fight this with a narrative, I wanted to fight it with a paper trail so complete no judge could mistake one for the other. Ethan watched me build it night after night at the kitchen table and said, once, quietly, that he didn't know how I stayed so calm. I told him calm wasn't the word for it. Calm was just anger that had learned to file itself alphabetically. 2 weeks in, Barbara hired a woman named Sandra Kessler to move into the carriage house as her live-in caregiver. Sandra arrived with a rolling suitcase and a folder of paperwork the very same day Diane filed our 20-day notice with the county. Barbara began appearing on her porch wrapped in a blanket, even in July, even when the temperature hit 86 degrees. She stopped walking to her mailbox and had Sandra do it instead. When I tried to speak to her directly, Sandra intercepted me at the porch steps and told me in a rehearsed tone that any further contact needs to go through Barbara's legal representative, and that elder abuse was a serious accusation we should all want to avoid. Nobody had accused anyone of elder abuse. Sandra had planted the phrase like a flag, and it worked exactly the way it was designed to. Our neighbor Walter Higgins, who'd lived 2 doors down for 11 years and used to wave at me every morning, stopped waving. He started standing at the property line in the evenings, arms crossed, watching our house like we were staging a home invasion of an 80-year-old grandmother instead of enforcing a lease violation. I tried once to speak to Sandra directly, woman to woman, away from Barbara's porch. I caught her at the mailbox on a Wednesday evening and asked her, plainly, whether she'd actually observed anything in Barbara that concerned her medically, any real mobility issue, any cognitive decline, anything at all that would justify the language she'd been using. Sandra hesitated for just a second too long before she answered. "I was hired to provide care and document the client's needs," she said, like she was reading from an index card. "That's what I'm doing." I asked her who was paying her and what the arrangement was. She told me that was confidential, between her and her employer, and walked back up the porch steps without another word. I remember standing in the driveway thinking that a woman being paid a fair, modest caregiver's wage doesn't usually need a rehearsed answer for a simple question. That detail sat with me longer than I expected it to. I called Gordon Pierce, a family law and property attorney Diane recommended, because this had stopped being a real estate matter and become something messier. Gordon read through everything Barbara's side had sent: the equitable interest claim, Sandra's caregiver contract, a printed pamphlet on elder abuse reporting that Sandra had apparently mailed to 3 of our neighbors. Gordon told us plainly that Barbara wasn't simply resisting eviction. She was building a narrative, brick by brick, designed to make us look like the villains before a single hearing ever happened. "She's not fighting to stay," Gordon said. "She's fighting to make you pay for making her leave." We didn't understand yet how literally he meant that. The next escalation came 3 weeks later, and it was the one that made my hands shake for the first time. Tyler called me from his dorm move-in day, 2 days early because Whitmore let incoming freshmen move belongings ahead of orientation, and told me his bank app was showing a balance of $611. He'd had $4,811 in that account 2 weeks earlier, savings from 3 summers of lifeguarding, and a small graduation gift from Diane. Barbara had never removed herself as a joint signer on Tyler's savings account. She'd opened it for him as a baby gift when he was 2 years old. A small gesture that had meant something to me once, and nobody had ever thought to change it because why would you? She withdrew $4,200 over 11 days, in amounts small enough not to trigger a fraud alert, and later, when Gordon subpoenaed the transaction memo, we learned she'd labeled each withdrawal rent payment received in her own personal ledger, building a paper trail to claim she'd been paying us for the carriage house the entire time. She stole from her own grandson to manufacture evidence. I sat Tyler down over video video call and explained what had happened, watching his face shift from confusion to something harder, something I hadn't seen in him before. "She took my lifeguard money," he said, flat, like he was testing the sentence to see if it was real. "For a rent thing that isn't even true." I told him Gordon would handle it, that we'd get it back, that this wasn't his fight to carry into his first semester. He said okay. He didn't sound okay. I spent 40 minutes on the phone with the bank's fraud department the next morning, on hold most of that time, listening to a looping recording about routing numbers. When a representative finally came on the line, she confirmed what Gordon suspected. Because Barbara was still a legal joint signer, the withdrawals weren't technically fraudulent from the bank's perspective. They were authorized transactions made by an authorized party. "There's nothing criminal on our end to flag," the representative told me, not unkindly. "You'd need to resolve authorization and intent through the courts." I hung up and sat in my car in the office parking garage for 10 minutes before I could make myself go inside for my 9 o'clock meeting. Barbara hadn't broken any law the bank could see. She'd simply used a door nobody had thought to lock on a 2-year-old's savings account, 16 years later, against the boy who used to bring her wildflowers from our backyard because she told him once, when he was 6, that she liked them. Around this time, I started noticing something small that I filed away without fully understanding, the same way I'd filed away the Thanksgiving phone call 6 years earlier. Sandra collected Barbara's mail from the box at the end of the driveway every afternoon at 4, but every few weeks there was an envelope that didn't go into Barbara's regular stack. A plain white envelope, business size, postmarked Boise, Idaho, addressed not to Barbara Whitcomb, but to B. Voss, Barbara's maiden name, at a return address that read only P.O. Box 4471. I asked Barbara about it once, over the fence, in the last civil conversation we had. She said it was some veterans forwarding service, leftover paperwork from Harold's benefits, and that it wasn't worth discussing. I let it go. I had a lease violation, a stolen savings account, and a mother-in-law with a hired caregiver threatening elder abuse charges. A mystery envelope from Idaho didn't make my priority list. The fourth blow landed in August, 10 days before Tyler's classes started. A city code enforcement officer knocked on our front door with a folder under his arm. Someone had filed a formal complaint against our address for unpermitted electrical wiring, specifically a subpanel I'd installed myself in the garage 6 years earlier, back when I was doing small home improvement jobs on weekends to save money we didn't have to spare. Barbara used to brag about that subpanel to her friends. "My son married a woman who can rewire a house," she'd say, back before I was trash, back when my competence was a party trick she liked to display. Now it was a fire hazard. The officer gave us 30 days to bring it up to code or face fines of $500 a day, and because Barbara's lawsuit had frozen our ability to fully control the property, we couldn't even get a licensed electrician into the carriage house's shared panel without her cooperation, which she withheld through Whitfield, citing ongoing litigation. I called an electrician myself the next morning anyway, a man named Ray Doss who'd done work for us before, and asked him to at least give me a quote for bringing the panel up to code so we'd have something ready the moment access opened up. He walked the property, looked at the shared panel from the outside, and told me the fix itself would run about $1,100 in parts and labor, a half-day's work for someone licensed. $1,100 and half a day, held hostage behind a lawsuit that existed because a 77-year-old woman had picked out grout color 6 years earlier. I wrote the estimate down on the same legal pad where I was already tracking Diane's fees and Gordon's fees, and for the first time since the graduation card, I let myself sit with the full, absurd shape of what was happening to us. A woman with the resources to write a check for the entire renovation twice over was slowly, deliberately, trying to bankrupt us over $1,100 of copper wire. Barbara made one more move that week, smaller than the others, but somehow the one that stung the most. She called my office and asked the front desk to connect her to my direct line, then told my assistant, a 26-year-old named Priya who I'd trained myself, that she was very concerned about Lauren's judgment lately, and wondered whether my employer knew I was in the middle of a serious family legal matter. Priya, to her credit, simply transferred the call to my voicemail without engaging, and told me about it afterward with the kind of wide-eyed disbelief of someone who'd never met a person like Barbara before. I never called Barbara back. There was nothing to say to a woman trying to get her son's wife fired over a lease dispute she'd manufactured herself. But I sat at my desk for a long moment after Priya told me, turning the phone over in my hands, understanding for the first time just how far Barbara was willing to reach to win. I sat at my kitchen counter that night with a legal pad, doing math I didn't want to do. Diane's fees, Gordon's fees, a $500 a day fine clock that hadn't started yet but could, Tyler's stolen money, the $85,000 we'd already sunk into a carriage house we could no longer legally control. Ethan sat across from me, quiet, running his thumb along the edge of the table the way he did when he didn't know what to say. "I don't understand how she affords a lawyer and a caregiver," I said, mostly to myself, on $1,200 a month. Ethan didn't have an answer. Neither did I. Not yet. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. The break came on a Tuesday, by accident, the way most true things do. Our regular mail carrier was out for a hip replacement, and a substitute had been running the route for 2 weeks. She didn't know our neighborhood, didn't know that Barbara's mail was supposed to go to the carriage house box and ours to the main house. On that particular Tuesday, an envelope meant meant for Barbara ended up in our mailbox instead, mixed in with a water bill and a Whitmore College parent newsletter. It was a plain envelope from a firm called Halverson and Cray Wealth Partners, based in Sacramento, California, addressed to Barbara J. Voss, not Whitcomb, Voss, her maiden name, the same name from the Idaho envelopes I'd noticed and dismissed for months. I stood at the end of our driveway holding it, and I knew before I opened it that I shouldn't. It wasn't addressed to me, but my hands opened it anyway, because some instinct older than manners was telling me this mattered. The first page was a quarterly portfolio summary, bar graphs, asset allocation percentages, a cover letter thanking Barbara for 22 years of trust in Halverson and Cray's management services. 22 years. Barbara had been a client of a wealth management firm for 22 years, which meant she'd opened this account roughly a decade before Harold even died, while she was still telling everyone she had nothing. I scanned past the graphs to the total at the bottom of the page. My eyes went to it twice because the first time I didn't believe what I was reading. $842,000. I sat down on the curb. I don't remember deciding to sit. My legs simply stopped holding me up. I read every page after that, twice each, my hands cold in the August heat. The portfolio was diversified across municipal bonds, index funds, and a real estate investment trust. There was a second account referenced in the cover letter, a companion account held at Cascade Trust Bank in Boise, Idaho, generating what the letter called supplemental tax-advantaged municipal bond income of $4,500 a month. $4,500 tax-free every single month on top of $842,000 sitting in California. The Idaho envelopes, the P.O. box, the Veterans Forwarding Service. That wasn't. The Thanksgiving phone call 6 years ago. I need to call my advisor about the accounts, which she'd explained away as insurance paperwork because I hadn't known enough to push back. It had all been sitting there in plain sight, in pieces too small to add up on their own, for years. I went back through the folder Gordon had helped us build, the receipts, the equity line statements, the second mortgage from the year Tyler was 11, and laid each one on the kitchen counter next to the Halverson and Cray summary, like evidence in a case I hadn't known I was building until that moment. $31,000 borrowed against our own home. The same year Barbara's portfolio, according to the account history attached to the letter, had crossed $600,000 for the first time. She'd have known that number. Somebody at Halverson and Cray would have sent her a year-end statement, the way they'd sent this one, and she'd have read it in the same carriage house where she told us, over Thanksgiving turkey, that she didn't know how she'd make it through another winter on her pension. Barbara had let me work 60-hour weeks to pay off Ethan's loans. She'd let us finance $22,000 of her carriage house on a home equity line, while she quietly compounded interest on nearly $1 million 2,000 miles away. She'd staged herself as a frail, fixed-income widow to a hired lawyer, a hired caregiver, and an entire street of neighbors. She'd stolen $4,200 from her own grandson's lifeguard money and labeled it rent to build a case, while she had enough sitting in a brokerage account to buy our house outright and still have most of it left over. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, on a card meant for her 18-year-old grandson, she'd called me trash. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Not then. I sat on the curb for maybe 6 minutes, long enough for the anger to settle into something colder and more useful. Then I stood up, walked inside, photographed every page of the letter on my kitchen counter, and opened an email to Gordon Pierce. Read the attached, I typed. Then, tell me exactly how fast we can end this. I hit send at 11:14 that night. I didn't sleep more than 2 hours. By 8 the next morning, my phone was ringing, and it was Gordon. "Lauren," he said, and his voice had a texture I hadn't heard from him before, something between disbelief and adrenaline. "Do you have any idea what you just handed me?" I told him I had a rough idea. "Her entire legal position is built on being a fixed-income widow with no resources," Gordon said. "Whitfield's equitable interest claim, the caregiver contract, the elder abuse framing, all of it assumes a jury or a judge will look at a frail woman with $1,200 a month and feel sympathy. If it comes out that she's been sitting on close to $900,000 this entire time, Whitfield drops her within the hour. No attorney wants to be caught building a poverty narrative for a client who was lying to him too. And the caregiver," I said. "If Sandra Kessler was hired and paid using funds Barbara claimed she didn't have, and if any of that caregiving contract was used to support fraudulent elder abuse threats, that's a problem for both of them," Gordon said. "But Lauren, listen to me. There's something bigger here." He paused long enough that I asked him to just say it. "The account under Barbara Voss, the maiden name, that's a privacy move, not necessarily illegal on its own," he said. "But if she's been filing income statements anywhere claiming poverty-level income while sitting on this kind of portfolio, that's fraud. Tax fraud, benefits fraud, or both, depending on what she's filed and where." I thought about the property tax bill for the carriage house, the one Ethan and I had been covering because Barbara's on a fixed income, the one that had always seemed lower than it should have been for a property with a fully renovated one-bedroom unit on it. "I think she's been filing for a senior income exemption with the county," I said slowly. "I remember Ethan signing something for her years ago, an assessor's form. I thought it was routine." Gordon went quiet for a second. "If that's true," he said, "and if she claimed an annual income under the county's $14,400 threshold while holding this portfolio, that's not a civil dispute anymore, Lauren. That's fraud against a government agency. That's the kind of thing that gets referred to a state fraud unit, not just a judge." I looked out the the kitchen window. Barbara was on her porch, wrapped in a blanket she didn't need in 84-degree heat, playing sick for anyone driving past. Walter's car slowed as it passed her, and he lifted a hand in a small, sympathetic wave. She had no idea what was sitting in my inbox. "I need you to understand something before you decide anything," Gordon said. "Right now, you're the one being painted as the villain in this story. The eviction, the elder abuse call, all of it. If we move forward with this, that flips completely. Barbara stops being a sympathetic widow and becomes a woman who committed fraud against a county agency for years while impoverishing her own family. That's not a small shift. People in this town will remember it. Ethan will have to sit with that for the rest of his life, watching his mother's name attached to a felony filing." "I know," I said. "I'm not telling you not to do it," Gordon said. "I'm telling you to be sure, because once the county has this, it isn't yours to take back. It becomes theirs." I thought about Tyler's bank app showing $611. I thought about the rehearsed way Sandra had said elder abuse to my face like a threat she'd practiced in a mirror. I thought about $85,000 and a home equity line, and a woman who wore black to my own vow renewal because celebrating my marriage to her son had never once been something she was willing to do. "I'm sure," I said. "Once I send this," Gordon said, "there's no walking it back. She'll fight dirtier before she fights clean. People do, when they've got nothing left to lose." I thought about the letter in my son's graduation card. I thought about 16 years of typing gig, 60-hour weeks, a black dress at my own vow renewal, hydrangeas ripped out of the ground for a patio paid in cash. "Send it," I said. "Lauren, send it," I said again. Gordon sent the documentation that afternoon to Whitfield's office, along with a formal letter putting him on notice that his client had misrepresented her financial status in connection with active litigation. He copied the county assessor's fraud division on a separate, carefully worded inquiry about the senior income exemption filed on the carriage house parcel 3 years earlier. He did not, at that point, contact the state pension board or Halverson and Cray directly. That would come later, and it would come from someone we didn't expect. I spent that day at work in a strange fog, answering emails, running a budget meeting for the quarterly ad spend, nodding at things my boss said, while underneath it all, a second version of my life was quietly detonating in a lawyer's inbox across town. Nobody at Callaway and Voss knew anything was happening. I remember thinking, somewhere around 3 in the afternoon, that this was probably how Barbara had lived for 22 years, carrying an entire hidden ledger behind an ordinary face, and that the thought made my stomach turn in a way I didn't examine too closely until much later. Whitfield called Barbara that same evening. I know this because Ethan, still trying to salvage some version of a relationship with his mother, walked over to the carriage house around 7 to check on her, and heard raised voices through the screen door before he even knocked. He told me later that Whitfield's voice was sharp, controlled, the voice of a man protecting himself. "You told me you had nothing," Whitfield said loud enough to carry. "You told me $1,200 a month. I built this whole filing around that." Barbara's response, according to Ethan, was to cry. Not the practiced, porch blanket crying she'd been doing for Walter's benefit for weeks. Something sharper, more panicked. "It's mine," she said. "I earned it. I saved for 40 years, and nobody is going to take it from me." Nobody had asked to take it from her. Nobody ever had. That was the part that stayed with me longest, turning it over that night in bed while Ethan lay silent beside me, staring at the ceiling. Barbara hadn't hidden that money because she was afraid of losing it to us. She'd hidden it because having it, and being seen as needing nothing from anyone, would have taken away the only leverage she had left in a family where her son had grown up, married, and built a life she didn't fully control. Poverty, real or performed, had been her currency for years. Wealth would have made her ordinary. Whitfield withdrew as her attorney of record 2 days later, filing a one-line motion citing irreconcilable conflicts regarding case representation. Diane, who saw the filing before we did, texted me a single line. "He's running. Smart man." Without Whitfield, Barbara's equitable interest claim collapsed within a week. There was no one left to argue that decorative grout selection constituted a legal ownership stake, and the judge assigned to the eviction matter, a woman named Judge Alvarez, who'd clearly seen every version of this maneuver before, dismissed the claim with what Diane described as visible irritation at having her docket wasted. Diane told me afterward that Judge Alvarez looked directly at Barbara, who'd appeared without counsel for the first time in the whole ordeal, and asked her, plainly, whether she understood that filing a claim she couldn't substantiate had cost the court real time that other families with actual emergencies, had been waiting for. Barbara reportedly said nothing. Diane said it was the first time she'd ever seen Barbara look genuinely small. But Barbara wasn't finished. Gordon had warned us she wouldn't fight clean once cornered, and he was right. Sandra Kessler, still living in the carriage house under her caregiving contract, escalated the elder abuse narrative on her own, apparently unaware that the financial ground beneath the entire arrangement had shifted. She called the county's Adult Protective Services line and reported that Ethan and I were attempting to forcibly remove a vulnerable 81-year-old woman from her home without cause, in retaliation for a family disagreement. A caseworker named Priya Anand came to our house on a Thursday afternoon. She was calm, thorough, and entirely unimpressed by theater. She interviewed Barbara alone in the carriage house for 40 minutes. She interviewed me and Ethan separately in our kitchen. She asked pointed, specific questions, the kind that suggested she'd already done some homework of her own, likely from the documents Gordon had sent to the county's fraud division days earlier. I found out afterward, through Gordon, that Priya's report noted Barbara presented no observable mobility limitations consistent with claimed frailty, and that financial documentation obtained separately raises significant concerns regarding the veracity of reported income and independent living capacity. The case was closed within the week, marked unsubstantiated, with a note referring the financial discrepancies to a separate agency for review. Sandra Kessler moved out 4 days later. I watched from the kitchen window as she loaded her rolling suitcase into a sedan and drove off without saying a word to anyone. We learned later, through Gordon's paperwork request during the fraud referral, that Barbara had been paying her $900 a week in cash, more than 3 times what a typical live-in companion earned in Fairhaven, likely to ensure her loyalty and her silence about the wealth Barbara clearly wasn't struggling to spend. The county assessor's fraud division moved faster than any of us expected. An investigator named Marcus Delgado called Gordon within 2 weeks of the referral, requesting the full Halverson and Cray documentation and Barbara's exemption filing history. What he found, and what he later confirmed in a formal notice mailed to Barbara directly, was that she had filed for the county's senior citizen homestead and income tax reduction program every year for the past 6 years, each time certifying under penalty of perjury that her annual household income did not exceed $14,400. Her actual income from the Boise account alone, $4,500 a month, came to $54,000 a year, before even counting whatever the California portfolio itself generated in dividends and interest. She had defrauded Merrill County out of an estimated $11,200 in reduced property taxes over 6 years, taxes that, notably, Ethan and I had been covering the shortfall on ourselves under the belief we were helping a woman who genuinely couldn't afford her share. The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't something I planned as carefully as everything before it. It happened on a Saturday morning in early September, on the driveway between our house and the carriage house, because Barbara had called Ethan the night before demanding a family meeting to discuss what she called this witch hunt. She wanted an audience. She got one, just not the one she expected. Ethan and I stood near the garage. Diane came, because she'd flown in for a hearing anyway and wasn't going to miss this. Gordon came, with a folder under his arm. Barbara stood on her porch step, no blanket this time, dressed and composed, the mask fully back on. Walter Higgins was in his yard, ostensibly trimming a hedge that didn't need trimming, close enough to hear every word. "I want this harassment to stop," Barbara said, addressing Ethan. "Not me, the way she always had. I am an old woman. I have been humiliated in front of my neighbors." "You've been humiliated by your own paperwork, Barbara," Gordon said evenly. "Not by us." Barbara's eyes flicked to him, then to the folder in his hand, then back to Ethan, searching for the version of this conversation where her son still protected her without question. I watched something in Ethan's face settle finally into a decision he'd been avoiding for 2 months. "Mom," he said, "you had $842,000 this whole time." He said it plainly, not as a question. Barbara opened her mouth, and I watched her run through her usual toolkit in real time, the deflection, the tears, the wounded dignity, and find that none of it had anywhere to land. "That money is mine," she said finally. "I earned every cent of it. I don't owe this family an explanation for how I manage what's mine." "You don't owe us an explanation for the money, Barbara," Diane said, stepping forward with the calm precision of someone who delivered this exact tone in 100 depositions. "You owe the county an explanation for 6 years of sworn income certifications that don't match what's sitting in Sacramento and Boise. That's not a family matter anymore. That's a matter of public record." Barbara's chin lifted. "You've always hated me," she said to Diane, which wasn't true, and wasn't even really an attempt at truth, just a reflex, a redirection thrown out to see if it would land somewhere softer. "I've never hated you," Diane said. "I've just never believed you. There's a difference, and I think you've spent 30 years counting on people not knowing it. You didn't have to explain it," I said. It was the first time I'd spoken since we'd walked outside. My voice was steady, quieter than hers, but it carried. "Nobody asked you for your money, Barbara. Not once, in 16 years. What you owed us was the truth. You let us think you had nothing so we'd keep giving you everything. You stole $4,200 from your own grandson's lifeguard money and called it rent. You called me trash in a letter to my son while you were sitting on nearly $1 million you never once offered to help this family with." Barbara's face had gone rigid. That particular stillness people wear when they realize an audience they'd been performing for is no longer on their side. Walter had stopped pretending to trim the hedge. I saw him lower the shears entirely, watching. "I am done," I said, "protecting you from the consequences of your own choices. You have until the end of this month to vacate the carriage house. Your attorney already knows why he walked away. The county already knows what you filed and signed. Whatever happens to you from here isn't something I'm doing to you, Barbara. It's something you built, one lie at a time, for 6 years." Nobody spoke for a moment. Barbara looked at Ethan one more time, searching, I think, for rescue. He didn't offer any. "You should have just told the truth," he said quietly. "Any of it. Ever." She went inside and shut the door. Through the window, I could see her sitting very still at her small kitchen table, the composed mask finally gone, replaced by something that looked, for just a second, like genuine fear. Walter crossed the property line that afternoon, which he hadn't done in 2 months. He apologized awkwardly for the cold shoulder. "She had me convinced," he said, shaking his head. "She's good. I'll give her that." I told him he wasn't the only one she'd fooled. unfold. The weeks after the confrontation moved fast, faster than the weeks before it had crawled. Marcus Delgado's investigation expanded once the county's findings were shared. At Gordon's urging, with the state's Department of Insurance, given Barbara's original wealth had partly originated from a life insurance settlement following Harold's death that she'd never reported as an asset on any subsequent filing. A parallel inquiry opened into whether Barbara had also misrepresented her income to qualify for a reduced-rate senior transit pass and a county property tax freeze unrelated to the homestead exemption, both of which required income certification under $14,000 a year. Barbara hired a second attorney, a woman named Denise Okafor, who specialized in white-collar defense, which told us more about the seriousness of Barbara's situation than any letter could have. Okafor's strategy, from what filtered back through Gordon, was damage control rather than denial. Full restitution of the $11,200 in unpaid property taxes, immediate repayment of Tyler's $4,200 with interest, and a negotiated plea on the fraud charges that would avoid prison in exchange for probation, restitution, and a formal admission of guilt on the record. The most unexpected call came in early October from a woman named Renee Voss, Barbara's younger sister, who I'd met exactly twice in 19 years of marriage, both times at funerals. She'd heard about the fraud case through a cousin and called our house directly, apologizing for the intrusion before I'd even finished saying hello. "I always wondered where Daddy's orchard money went," she said. Their father had sold 40 acres of land outside Springfield in the early 90s, split 3 ways between Barbara and her 2 siblings, and Renee had never understood why Barbara, alone among the 3 of them, never seemed to have a dollar of it left. "She told us she'd lost it in a bad investment in the 90s, Renee said. "I believed her for 30 years. I sent her $2,000 myself 6 years ago, right after Harold passed, because she told me she was struggling." She was quiet for a moment. "I'd like that back, if it's not too much to ask. But mostly I called because I thought you should know you're not the only one she's done this to. I'm sorry it took someone finding her mail by accident for any of us to see it. I hadn't expected an ally from Barbara's own side of the family, and I hadn't expected how much it would matter. Hearing that the pattern predated me by decades, that I hadn't imagined the shape of it, that a woman who'd known Barbara for 73 years had also spent her life being quietly, carefully managed." Gordon added Renee's account to the restitution claim. Barbara repaid her $2,000 in November, the same week as her plea, in a cashier's check with no note attached. Ethan struggled through all of it in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. He wasn't angry the way I was. He was grieving, quietly, in the evenings, sitting in the garage with the door half open, not really doing anything, just sitting. I found him there one night in late September, 3 weeks after the confrontation, and sat down on the step beside him without saying anything for a while. "I keep trying to figure out when she became like this," he finally said. "If it was always there, or if it happened slowly, and I just didn't want to see it." I didn't have an answer for him. I still don't, fully. I think some people build their whole identity around scarcity, real or performed, because scarcity gives them a story where they're the one who sacrificed, the one who's owed something. Barbara had been the widow on a fixed income for 6 years, and I think some part of her needed that story more than she needed the money itself. Giving it up, even just being seen clearly, might have felt like losing the only version of herself she knew how to be. There was a quiet grief in it for me too, one I hadn't expected. I'd spent 16 years hoping somewhere underneath the resentment that Barbara and I would eventually find our footing, that Tyler would grow up with a grandmother who adored him without conditions, that some version of the woman who occasionally showed real warmth, who'd once spent an entire Sunday teaching 8-year-old Tyler to bake her mother's shortbread recipe, might someday become the whole of her instead of the exception. That woman was gone now, or maybe she'd never fully existed apart from the performance. Either way, I mourned her, briefly, the week after the confrontation, standing in my kitchen holding a shortbread tin Barbara had given Tyler years ago, before I put it back in the cabinet and went back to packing his winter clothes for his first cold snap at Whitmore. Diane handled the eviction's final paperwork without incident, since Barbara, facing a mounting fraud case, no longer had the appetite or the legal representation to keep fighting a losing battle over a carriage house. She vacated on the 28th of September, moving into a modest 1-bedroom apartment across town that she paid for, we later learned, entirely in cash, first and last month plus deposit, $2,800, from an account she still somehow had access to despite the mounting restitution obligations. Some habits apparently don't break just because the story around them collapses. I helped Ethan clear out the carriage house the weekend before she moved, boxing up decades of belongings that had never quite fit and never quite left storage. In the back of a hallway closet, behind a stack of Harold's old fishing gear, I found a small fireproof lockbox, unlocked, holding nothing but folded bank statements going back 11 years, each one carefully organized by date, a private archive of a fortune she'd built in silence while telling the rest of us she had nothing. I didn't say anything to Ethan about it. I photographed the statements for Gordon and put the box back exactly where I'd found it, and I let Barbara carry it out to her car herself on moving day, unaware that its contents had already been seen, already been counted, already been turned into the evidence that would end the story she'd spent 6 years telling. There was one complication in the middle of all of it that I hadn't anticipated. Marcus Delgado's office, early in the investigation, briefly flagged Ethan and me as potential co-filers on the homestead exemption, since Ethan's signature appeared appeared on one of the earlier assessor forms alongside Barbara's. Back when we thought we were simply helping her navigate paperwork, she found confusing. For 11 days in late September, we didn't know whether we'd be swept into the fraud referral ourselves, whether ignorance of what Barbara had been hiding would matter at all to an investigator moving quickly through a stack of filings. Gordon spent those 11 days building a timeline showing every dollar Ethan and I had contributed toward Barbara's share of the property taxes, proof that we'd been covering shortfalls we believed were real, not participating in a scheme to create them. Delgado cleared us formally on October the 2nd, in a letter that used the word "no evidence of knowing participation," a phrase I read probably a dozen times, relieved and a little sick that it had ever needed to be written at all. Tyler got his $4,200 back in mid-October, plus $311 in court-ordered interest, deposited directly into a new account that Diane made sure Barbara had no signing authority over. He called me the day it landed. "It feels weird," he said, "like I don't really want it. I just want it to have never happened." I told him I understood that feeling better than he knew. The county finalized its case in November. Barbara pleaded guilty to a single count of filing a fraudulent income certification, a fourth-degree felony under state law, and entered a negotiated agreement requiring full restitution of the $11,200 owed to Merrow County, a 2-year probation period, 100 hours of community service, and a permanent disqualification from any future income-based county benefit program. The state insurance inquiry closed separately with a smaller civil penalty tied to unreported settlement income, $4,000, paid in full within a week, in cash. I sat in the back of the courtroom the day she entered her plea. I hadn't planned to go, but Diane thought it mattered that I see it through to the end, and she was right. Barbara stood at the defense table in a gray suit, no black this time, and answered the judge's questions in a small, clipped voice I'd never heard her use before. She didn't look back at me once. I don't think she could. It's been almost a year now. Ethan and I finished repaying the home equity line on the carriage house renovation in June, ahead of schedule, since we no longer had a second monthly property tax obligation to cover for anyone else. We rented the carriage house to a young couple, teachers at the elementary school 2 streets over, who pay on time and wave from their porch and have never once called me trash. I replanted hydrangeas along the fence line in October, a different variety this time, one that blooms later into the fall, and I think about that decision more than I probably need to. Something about starting over with roots that take a little longer to show color. Tyler is doing well at Whitmore. He's studying mechanical engineering, like his father, and calls most Sundays, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to ask me questions about budgeting that make me laugh because I used to ask my own mother the same ones at his age. He hasn't spoken to Barbara since the confrontation on the driveway. He told me once on the phone in October that he doesn't feel angry about it anymore, mostly just tired, and that he thinks that's probably the healthiest place to land. I think he's right. Ethan visits Barbara occasionally, once a month or so, mostly out of obligation and a lingering thread of love he hasn't figured out how to fully release. He comes home from those visits quiet, sometimes for the rest of the evening. I don't push him on it. Grief doesn't always look like tears. Sometimes it looks like a grown man sitting in his garage with the door half open, working through what it means to finally see his mother clearly, and loving her anyway, from a careful distance. Barbara completed her 100 hours of community service in July, filing paperwork at the county library twice a week, according to Ethan, who saw the sign-in sheet once when he picked her up. She still has roughly $700,000 left, after restitution, penalties, and legal fees. More money than she'll likely spend in whatever years she has remaining. She lives alone now. Sandra never resurfaced. Whitfield, the last I heard, was still running his late-night television ads 2 counties over, unbothered, as men like that tend to be. Walter Higgins waved at me again for the first time on a Tuesday in late October, and by December he was the one who suggested the whole street do a joint holiday gathering, the kind of thing Barbara would have hosted once and made sure everyone knew she'd hosted. We did it at our house instead. Nobody wore black. As for me, I think about the letter often. Use this to become someone real, Tyler. Look at your father. He wasted his potential marrying an office temp. I used to think Barbara's contempt for me was about class, about the specific math of what my father made driving a delivery truck versus what Harold made managing insurance claims. I understand now it was never really about money. Barbara had almost $1 million and still needed someone to look down on. Low-class trash was never a description of me. It was a mirror she couldn't afford to look into directly, so she pointed it at me instead. I don't feel triumphant, exactly, when I think about how it ended. I feel something quieter than that, something closer to peace, with a thin seam of sadness running through it, for the family we could have been, for the grandmother Tyler could have had, for the $85,000 and 16 years I spent trying to build a bridge to someone who was never going to meet me halfway. I don't regret exposing what she hid. I regret that it was ever necessary. Those are different things, and I've learned to let them sit side by side instead of pretending one cancels out the other. What I know now, more clearly than I've ever known anything, is that real class was never about what you have. It's about what you're willing to be honest about and what you're willing to let other people keep, even when you have the power to take it. Barbara had $842,000 and spent it protecting a lie. I had $61,000 a year and a pair of hands that knew how to wire a sub-panel, plant a hydrangea, and raise a son who calls his mother every Sunday just to talk. I know which one of us actually built something real. Some nights I still catch myself rehearsing the version of of this story where I never opened that envelope, where the substitute mail carrier stayed home sick, and Barbara's secret sat safely in Sacramento for another decade, and I try to imagine what our lives would look like now under that version. I can't quite get there. I think eventually some other crack would have opened, because a lie that size doesn't stay buried forever. Not really. It just waits for the next person foolish enough to trust the ground it's standing on. I'm glad in the end that it was me who found it, and not Tyler 10 years from now, going through his grandmother's things after she was gone, discovering all at once that the woman who called his mother trash had a fortune the whole time, and chose deliberately, again and again, not to share a scent of warmth or safety with the family living 20 feet from her door. He got to see it while there was still time to be angry about it, and still time, maybe someday, to let that anger settle into something more like understanding. That's more than I got to give my own mother, who never had a fortune to hide and never once made me wonder if her hardship was a costume. I think about her sewing our tablecloths by hand, honest about every dollar she didn't have, and I think that's the inheritance that actually mattered, not the $85,000. Not the carriage house, the plain, unglamorous habit of telling the truth, even when the truth doesn't flatter you. Barbara never learned it. I hope, in whatever years she has left, some version of her still might.